There is one metal that mold simply cannot survive on, and almost nobody keeps it in their home anymore. It is not silver. It is not gold. It is copper. And what it does to mold is so effective that hospitals have started rebuilding their doorknobs and bed rails out of it. Yet in the average kitchen and bathroom, copper has quietly vanished, replaced by plastic and painted steel that look clean but protect you from nothing. This is the story of a metal that fights mold on contact, without chemicals, without electricity, without you doing a single thing, and the simple, unglamorous reason it disappeared from your home. Stay with me, because by the end you will understand exactly why one small piece of copper can do something a whole bottle of bleach cannot. For thousands of years, people lined their water jars, their cups, and their cooking vessels with copper. Ancient Egyptians used it to store water and treat wounds. They had no idea what a microbe was, but they could see that water kept in copper simply stayed cleaner, longer. This was not superstition. It was observation. Something about the metal itself kept rot and slime from taking hold. Sailors once nailed copper sheets to the bottoms of their ships to stop weeds and barnacles from clinging on. Farmers rubbed copper compounds onto their vines to hold back fungus and blight. Doctors in the ancient world pressed copper against wounds to keep infection away. None of them knew the mechanism. They only knew, from generation to generation, that copper kept living things from spoiling what it touched. And for most of human history, that knowledge was passed down quietly, from hand to hand, without a single scientific word to explain it. Then, in the 1800s, the first real clue appeared. A French researcher noticed that people who worked directly with copper, the metalworkers, the smelters, seemed strangely protected during deadly cholera outbreaks. While others around them fell ill, the copper workers were often spared. He gathered case after case and presented his findings to the French academies of science and medicine. Something on their skin, something about constant contact with copper, was keeping a killer disease away. Then, near the end of that century, scientists gave the effect a name. They called it the oligodynamic effect, the ability of certain metals to destroy microbes in tiny amounts purely on contact. Molds, spores, fungi, bacteria, even some viruses, all of them weakened or killed by metal ions, even at very low concentrations. Copper was not just clean, it was actively hostile to life it did not want. And here's where the science gets genuinely strange, in the best possible way. When a single mold spore drifts through the air and lands on a clean copper surface, the attack begins almost instantly. The metal starts releasing copper ions, charged particles that the spore has no defense against. The first thing those ions do is tear into the spore's outer membrane, the thin wall that holds it together. They punch through it, and the cell begins to leak out the very nutrients it needs to survive. For a mold spore, that alone is often a death sentence. It dries out before it can ever take root. But copper does not stop at the wall. The ions push their way inside the cell, and once they are in, they set off a chain reaction. Inside the spore, copper triggers a burst of what scientists call reactive oxygen, a kind of violent internal rusting. These reactive molecules are like microscopic shrapnel. They tear apart the mold's proteins, damage its internal machinery, and shred its DNA from the inside out. The spore's ability to breathe, to make energy, to reproduce, all of it collapses at once. So the mold does not slowly wither over days. It is dismantled quickly before it can grow into the fuzzy black or green patch you would eventually see on a wall. This is the part almost nobody talks about. Copper does not just stop mold. It destroys the spore at the very first moment of contact, before there is any mold to see at all. And it does this silently, 24 hours a day, for years, without any power, any spray, or any effort from you. Scientists have counted more than 100 separate studies trying to map exactly how copper does all this. What they keep finding is that it does not attack in just one way. It attacks in many ways at once. It warps the shape of the mold's proteins so they can no longer do their jobs. It jams the chemical reactions the cell needs to make energy. It breaks apart the genetic code the spore would use to copy itself. This is why microbes struggle to build any resistance to copper the way they do to so many chemicals. It is very hard to evolve a defense against an enemy that comes at you from a dozen directions at the same time. A spore that lands on copper is not facing a single poison. It is facing a full collapse of everything that keeps it alive. Now, let us compare that to what almost everyone reaches for the moment they spot mold, a bottle of bleach. This is where things get uncomfortable, because most of what people believe about bleach and mold is simply wrong. On a hard, non-porous surface, a glass shower door, a glazed tile, a metal sink, bleach can wipe out the mold you can see. On those surfaces, it works well enough. But the moment you take bleach to anything porous, wood, drywall, grout, fabric, it quietly fails you. And to understand why, you have to understand what mold actually is. Mold is not a stain sitting on top of a surface. It is a living organism with roots. It sends out microscopic, thread-like structures, some of them dozens of times thinner than a human hair, and it drives them deep down into the material. On drywall, those threads burrow through the paper and into the core. On wood, they follow the grain far below the surface. What you see on the wall is only the very tip of a colony that is living deep inside. Now here's the problem with bleach that almost no label will ever tell you. Household bleach is mostly water, around 90% of it, in fact. When you spray it onto a porous surface, two things happen at once. The active chlorine, the part that actually kills, sits on the surface and evaporates within minutes. But the water, the other 90%, soaks straight down into the pores. And water is the single thing mold needs most to grow. So think about what you have really done. You wiped away the mold you could see. And at the very same time, you delivered a fresh drink of water directly to the roots you could not see. That is why, a few days later, the mold comes back. And often it comes back stronger, spreading wider than before. Because you did not kill it. You fed it. Many experts, including major environmental agencies, now openly warn against using bleach on porous surfaces for exactly this reason. It looks like a solution. It is often the opposite. Copper works in the completely opposite way. It does not need to soak in. It does not need to reach any roots. Because copper stops mold at the one moment that matters most. The moment a spore first lands, before a single root has formed. It kills on contact, at the surface, around the clock, and it never needs to be reapplied. There is no evaporation, no fumes, no residue. The metal just sits there, quietly lethal to mold, doing its job whether you are paying attention or not. And this is not a fringe idea from the internet. This is something hospitals have tested in the real world, on real wards, with real patients. In hospitals, some of the most dangerous places for germs are the surfaces everyone touches: door handles, bed rails, taps, toilet seats. On ordinary plastic and stainless steel, harmful microbes can survive for days, even weeks, waiting like tiny traps for the next hand to come along. So researchers ran a bold experiment. They swapped out those ordinary surfaces for solid copper, and then they measured what happened. In one early hospital trial, the copper taps, handles, and toilet seats carried between 90 and 100% fewer bacteria than the exact same items made from standard materials right next to them. Let that sink in. Almost nothing survived on the copper. And it did not require the staff to clean more or change their behavior in any way. The copper simply worked, on its own, in the background. The results were repeated in hospitals across different countries: the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, Finland. Again and again, the pattern held. Fewer live microbes on copper. Every time. Then the United States Environmental Protection Agency did something it very rarely does for a plain, uncoated metal. After reviewing the studies, it officially registered copper and hundreds of its alloys as antimicrobial materials. Its conclusion was blunt. Solid copper surfaces kill more than 99.9% of certain dangerous bacteria within just 2 hours of contact. A raw, natural metal, earning a government registration normally reserved for disinfectants and pesticides. That is how strong the evidence is. So now we arrive at the real question, the one that probably brought you here. If copper is this powerful, this proven, this effortless, why is it not in every kitchen, every bathroom, every damp corner of every home? Why did we ever stop using it? And here I am going to be completely honest with you, because you deserve the truth, not a fairy tale. There is no secret cabal hiding copper from you, no shadowy group locking it away. The real reason is far more ordinary, and in a way, far more frustrating. The reason is money. Copper is expensive. Plastic and stainless steel are cheap. A molded plastic handle can be stamped out by the thousands for a few cents each. A copper fixture cannot. It costs more to make, more to shape, more to buy. So over the last century, as homes were built faster and cheaper, copper was quietly pushed aside. Not because it stopped working. It never stopped working. But because someone realized you could sell a plastic version for far less. And here is the part that stings. A plastic surface does nothing to fight mold. Nothing at all. Which means the mold comes back, and you buy another spray, another cleaner, another bottle, again and again. A copper surface protects itself for years and asks nothing in return. You can see why one of those is easier to build a business around. This is why so many old, forgotten materials fade away. Not because they failed us, but because they worked too well and too quietly to keep selling. Copper does not need refills. Copper does not need a subscription. And that, more than any conspiracy, is why it slipped out of our homes. But here is the good news. Copper never actually went anywhere. It is still all around us, waiting. Think about where a spore is most likely to land and take hold in your home. The damp handle by the shower, the tap in the bathroom, the edge of a windowsill where condensation gathers every morning. These are exactly the small, high-contact spots where a piece of solid copper earns its place. A copper strip along a chronically damp shelf. A copper fixture where plastic once sat. Even the copper mesh that some people tuck into corners where moisture likes to collect. The key word, always, is solid copper, the real, uncoated metal. A shiny copper-colored coating over plastic does almost nothing, because it is the bare metal releasing its ions that does the work. And you do not need to polish it to a mirror. Yes, over time, copper develops a darker layer, and eventually that greenish tint called patina. That patina is simply the metal reacting with air and moisture. It is not mold, even though people often mistake it for mold. A heavily crusted surface can slow the ion release a little, so a light clean now and then keeps it at its best. But even aged, darkened copper is still working far harder against mold than the bright, dead plastic sitting next to it. Now, before you go and wrap your entire house in copper, I owe you the honest limits. Because I am not here to sell you a miracle. Copper is powerful, but it is not magic. First, copper works best when it is reasonably clean. If a thick layer of grime, dust, or a slimy film called biofilm builds up on top of it, that layer can shield the mold from the copper underneath. The metal is still there, but the spores are no longer touching it, so a copper surface still benefits from the occasional wipe. It is low effort, not zero effort. Second, and this is the big one, copper controls mold. It does not cure the reason mold appeared. Mold needs one thing above all else to grow: moisture. If your bathroom stays damp, if a pipe leaks, if condensation pools on a cold wall, mold will keep finding new places to grow. Places your piece of copper never touches. Copper is a shield, not a solution to a wet room. The real, permanent fix for mold is always the same, and it never changes. Find the source of the moisture and stop it. Fix the leak. Improve the airflow. Lower the humidity. Dry the space. Do that first, always. Copper is the quiet guardian you add on top. The thing that stops spores at the surfaces they love, on contact, without chemicals, without effort, for years. So think of it this way. Bleach waits until the mold is already there, then fails to reach its roots, and often feeds it. Copper never lets the mold get started in the first place. One is a reaction. The other is a defense. For thousands of years, we understood this without knowing why. Then we learned exactly why, and traded it all away for something cheaper. The metal never changed. Only our priorities did. A single piece of copper, in the right place, does something no spray in your cabinet can. It does not wait for you to notice the mold. It stops it before it ever begins.